Hey everyone, this is episode 54, talking more about visas, but more globally, and just like a lot of insight that I wanted to give on the subject. So hopefully you find this beneficial and lots of cool stuff to get into. So let's dive in.
Welcome to the Allan Mckay podcast. Allan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Allan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Allan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on allanmckay.com.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 54. So lots to get into. What I was thinking of originally was going to be, this is going to be a bit more of a mixed bag. I don't know why I kept just in my notes always referring to it this way. However, I think I'm going to shift gears a little bit and make it mainly focused on visas again, because this was one of the main things I wanted to cover, was basically doing some additional content on the whole visa subject, and not just specifically for the US. Okay, so that way, like, touch base a little bit more internationally, so that way if like you're more curious about going to Australia, somewhere else, then this would be more tailored for everyone rather than it being just for the US, but also just throwing a lot of stuff on the end of it that is more kind of just additional information. Because like we did in episode 52, I did an interview with Amanda Gillespie, who I see as being a big pro on the subject. She's amazing and she covered so much, but I felt like there's a lot more smaller bits and pieces I just want to kind of throw on the end of it, but I felt like I didn't want to get it mixed up with everything that we were talking about together. So it's more, I just want to do this as like a separate episode. And just as a heads up, I just want to quickly say, like, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a pro. Anything I say in this episode about visas and everything else is just purely my perspective and my experiences with it. And, very possibly there's bound to be stuff that I'm getting wrong, whether it's completely wrong or just, definitely there's probably going to be a lot more information that could be shared on the subject. So, I'm happy to say everything I'm going to say, but, rather than taking my word for it, anything that, you really want to know, I'd definitely say speak to Amanda or speak to another expert on the subject who's qualified to really kind of answer things a lot more in depth. Whew, okay. And, all right. So other than that, like, I did want to get into some other content. I did want to get into some other subjects, but I might leave that to another episode and kind of keep this all focused on one thing. But what I probably will be doing is next episode, I'm going to answer like a big Q&A. So I'm going to start answering people's questions about a lot of stuff that you might want to know about. So whether it's career stuff or other things. And in addition, there's just like a lot of really big things I want to get into. I think it's going to be a really cool episode, but I will leave it a little bit longer. So the next few episodes I have coming up are going to be really good ones. I'm going to resume doing the interviews again just after January. So probably the next two episodes, I've got interviews with people from like Microsoft, everywhere. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head. It's crazy times for me right now. So I mean, as much as I wanted this month to be all about kind of giving the keys to you to give you everything you need to kind of get started for next year. This year is also like I'm getting ready for the mentorship, which I'll be launching this weekend, finally, opening the doors to sign up. It's been a long time coming, just I've been putting so much work into getting it all ready. And on top of that, just everything else, ending the year, wrapping things up. It's been a really intense time. And so lots of cool episodes coming up, a lot more interviews, which are going to be really cool. Some really cool announcements. It's full on. So I'm excited. I'll shut up and let's just dive into this. But if you have any questions, like I said, in the next episode, I'm going to start doing a big Q&A and answering a lot of these. So I think there's a lot of great ones, even stuff like, hey, I did some freelance work and I never got paid. And like, how do I approach them and get paid for the work I did without, kind of cutting ties with them and whatever else. That's just like one of hundreds of examples of questions that I get asked a lot. So if you want, leave a comment in the show notes, and the show notes are www.allanmckay.com/54, and just leave a note in there about questions you have. And if they're personal and you don't necessarily want to be posting them everywhere and you'd rather them be answered anonymously, shoot me an email. So just amckay@allanmckay.com. Again, I'll leave all the information in the show notes, but that's just a chance to, I'm happy to answer questions, and this will be a chance to kind of really go in depth with a lot of this stuff, because I get emails pretty much every day, like lots of them about a lot of different stuff, and they're really great questions, and I try to answer all of them, but some of them I keep putting off because I want to kind of really give a proper in-depth response. So I'm like, no, I want to spend like 30 minutes and really give my heart to this and like give it everything that I can about this question, or give them all this information. The thing is that by doing that, I put it aside until I've got time later that day, and then that gets pushed back to the next day and the next day. And yeah, it's just unfortunately one of those things that happens. But this will be a chance that I'll be able to take some time out and like really answer in depth some questions. And on top of that, there's a lot of other cool stuff I want to talk about as well as what I've got planned for the future, some really cool upcoming announcements. As you can tell, I'm talking a million miles an hour, just running and gunning right now. But I'll leave it there. But like I said, leave comments in the show notes, and more really cool episodes coming up. I'll try and keep them consistently coming out Monday mornings. But again, this month has been one of those months. So I think it's Tuesday now. I actually got to check what day it is, but I think, yeah, it's Tuesday, the 29th. So this is when it's coming out. So enjoy, guys and girls. And I will just say Happy New Year for all of you. And if you're in LA, maybe I'll see you out on the street partying. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to 2016. It's going to be a really cool year, and I hope it is for everyone. I've been really excited about this year, and more on that in the next episode. Actually, one final thing I'm just going to mention now, and that is I'm putting out 8 hours of free visual effects training later on this week. So this will be something that, for the most part, will just be exclusive to my insiders list. If you want this stuff, you want to sign up for it. Basically, I'm going to be setting out like a bunch of video training on destruction and pyro and everything else. So this isn't going to be for everyone. It's more if you're 3D effects, whatever. But I'm going to be putting together 8 hours of visual effects training, going through kind of like the feature film process for doing destruction that you would see in a lot of big movies, that sort of thing, as well as fume effects for going through how to create like massive explosions, that sort of thing. So again, not everyone's cup of tea, but if this is something that interests you, just go to www.allanmckay.com/54download, or it'll be in the show notes, which is just allanmckay.com/54. But 54 download, that will be a place to sign up, and I'll be able to email you the content when it becomes available at the end of the week. Okay, so check that out and enjoy. First of all, I want to thank everyone for sharing the visa episode. So episode 52 with Amanda Gillespie. There's a couple hundred times it was shared on Facebook and everything. Really, really cool. And for me, I really appreciate that, because I think that this information can be really valuable to everyone. And, I'm really grateful for that. So again, if you do find these episodes to be useful, just click the share button, and, I'd be really grateful for that. So first of all, I'm just going to say that this episode is going to be a bit unplanned. I'm just going to kind of go with the flow here. So there's definitely going to be mistakes along the way. Some of these I literally will spend like a day writing all my notes and going through and really carefully planning. Whereas it's Christmas, and I've got a lot on my plate with the mentorship coming up. So that all being said, let's talk visas. Okay, so first of all, and again, I'm just going to do this really rugged and unplanned, but let's just talk about the process. Okay, so you want to come work in the US, and I might talk a little bit about other countries as well, but typically for you to go work here, it's not going to be your decision. You're not going to say, okay, where's the form that I get to show up in the US and I'm good to go? It's actually going to be the employer that needs to apply for this on your behalf. So you got to keep that in mind, that for you to get a job, you're going to need to actually go and find a job first, and then they go through the process of applying for a visa for you. Now, I remember back like at the beginning of my career, I really wanted to work in the US, and it was one of those things about like finding a place that would be willing to sponsor me and to go through the process. Then you need to qualify. It just seemed like this endless thing where I didn't think I would ever be able to do it. And it is a lot of work to do, but at the same time, like you got to understand why. And that is that it isn't some like, I've heard a lot of people speak negatively, like, oh, it's so BS, like you're going to go through all this stuff. But you got to consider the fact that there are going to be certain countries that have a huge amount of people worldwide all wanting to come in and work, okay? Especially like Hollywood, places like that. Everyone's going to want to come over here, and they're all going to want to work in the industry. So if you have like these hotspots of like cities and around the world that everyone is going to, you got to think about the people that are already there. In other words, every country is going to look out for their own, first of all. So if you already have all these pre-existing people that live in the US, that are American citizens, that were born here, grew up here, and then suddenly you've got other people wanting to come in and, try their luck at, working in Hollywood as an actor or director or, in VFX, whatever it's going to be, you got to think about the fact that for every single job that gets taken, you're essentially taking away a job from someone who's already an American citizen, already living here. And so if that was a situation where if all these other people come in and take all the jobs, then that's really going to affect the economy over here, because suddenly you've got a lot of people who aren't able to work and aren't able to get by because you've got a lot of other people coming in. And so there's like this big stability issue with that. And this is like a standard thing worldwide that happens, but obviously there will be these big hotspots in the world, such as, let's say, London, New York, LA, Vancouver, to some degree, would say like Toronto, Montreal, Sydney, Australia, even New Zealand these days is getting a lot of attention as well. And then Prague, there are going to be various cities worldwide that are going to have a lot of people wanting to relocate over there to work and live and everything else. And, those are just a few, but think about that like there is very valid reasons why there are visas. The process for going through immigration in the US is a bit different to others. And again, it's, I guess, got to compensate for the fact that it is such a big country, and it needs to balance out the fact that everyone here needs to be able to work on top of all the other people that are coming in. So typically when you apply for a visa, at least on paper, what you're essentially doing is you need to essentially prove to the US government or to immigration, USCIS, that you're doing a job, you're taking a job that no one else in the US can fill. Okay, and that's a really important thing. Like, even though it isn't as black and white as that, essentially you are trying to say that no one else in the country can do this job, so therefore your employer needs to look outside the US for this person, this specific person with a specific talent that they need. Okay, otherwise, the whole case is going to be, well, why don't you hire someone within the US, which is a perfectly valid reason. So some other countries are going to have things like holiday working visas, so that way you could go to Australia, you could go to the UK, and you essentially could go there for 3 months or 6 months to visit, but at the same time, like, you can take a job within a certain price range. Again, I don't know all the specifics because I live in Australia and I haven't really been to the UK, but you're essentially coming in for a vacation for a temporary set amount of time, but you are allowed to work a certain amount within that time, and it's because that way, you can work and live. It's not like you're going over and staying there permanently, and at the same time, you're not losing a crap load of money going on this like extended vacation. So typically there's like an age limit around this, therefore you could go as long as you're under 33 or whatever it's going to be. And so that way, as you're young, you can have all these kind of life experiences where, hey, I lived in Australia, backpacking around for 6 months, and then I went off to, wherever it's going to be, New Zealand or around Vietnam or wherever you're set up or wherever you want to go, you can find a sustainable way to do that. And so typically there's usually an agreement in place. Again, I'm not an expert on all this stuff, but with each country. So therefore, if one country can do it, typically the other ones can as well. But again, it's more country specific that there are different types of visas. Same way that if you were to work in some countries and let's say your husband or your wife comes with you, whether or not they can work as well. And this can be a bit of a frustrating thing because in the US, you don't necessarily have that ability. There usually isn't like a spouse visa that allows you to work. You may be able to stay in the country, but you won't be able to work. And I think that's a really important one to be aware of. I've had a lot of friends who've come over to the US to work and they're really happy. Their partner is really happy temporarily, but after a while, they want to work as well. And it's kind of unfair that one person's essentially giving up their career to allow the other one to go after their dreams. So temporarily, it might sound like a really great experience, but after a while, it's like, look, let's say the guy has the job and the girl doesn't, then it's unfair that the girl needs to miss out on the opportunity, or vice versa. I've got plenty of friends who come over and their husbands are literally sitting around like, great, I get to play video games all day, this is awesome. And then after a while, again, money is always like one of the big issues with relationships anyway. Either one person resents the other just because they're not able to chip in, but they're doing it because they're sacrificing so that way they can be with the other person, and vice versa. They might want to have a job and have bring in money and have that fulfillment with what they're doing. And so some countries, they have that in place, and it's great. It means that two people can come over and work and do their thing, rather than it being like, okay, you're coming over to work and the other person, is allowed to tag along, but you're not allowed to work. You're just basically going to be chilling at home or wherever it's going to be. So those are also things just to keep in mind, because it can be such a big deal. I've got friends in Canada, same deal. They want to come to the US, even though Canada and the US have like a really great relationship. Their partner would not be able to work, and it's just like, okay, screw that. I want to, I want both of us to be able to work, or he or she wants to work as well. So again, it just really kind of comes down to what your priorities and what your partner's priorities are, but that's definitely a big one, and I think it's one that gets overlooked until you start to really look into this stuff more. And like I said, the big thing is going to be the fact that you need to prove that you qualify for coming over here. It's not like just having an employer and you can come over. They need to actually put together a case for you on behalf of you, saying that this person qualifies. We want to bring them in, for this job that only they can do. And so it goes beyond just finding an employer, because, other countries, you might come over for a vacation and you're working a little bit, but you find a full-time job and then you move over. Whereas here, and again, like it just depends on the country, the specific one. But here, that is not something that you're typically going to be able to do. You need to come in, like if you're coming here for work or with the intent to work, you're going to need to have all that stuff lined up. So in other words, you have to have all of that set up before you come in. You can't just rock up and be like, time to look for work, because that's a big no-no. So what actually will happen is that you need to go find an employer, and then they need to put together a case saying that Allan or whoever it is basically the person that we need to hire, and there's no one else that we can find that fits these qualifications. Here is what this person can do in terms of, here's their resume, here's everything else. This is someone that qualifies for this job. And again, that just goes through that filter of, otherwise everyone can show up, and if you just get people just flying in from every single country, taking up all these jobs, there are going to be a lot of people who are missing out on jobs that are residents or occupants of the country, and therefore are losing out on work. And that's the imbalance that you don't want. And I mentioned this in episode 52 with Amanda about a TV show called How to Start Your Own Country. And if you Google it, I just did, and like it's on YouTube. You should be able to check it out. But like I watched, I think 3 episodes of that, but it was so fascinating just to kind of see the process of why things are done, which is why I think like when you're learning stuff, you got the people who go and do all the training and they learn how to do something, but then you got the people who figure things out. And I found that with filmmaking and a few other subjects where rather than just going through and doing, reading up on step 3, do this, rather I would want to fall into a problem like, I had this thing happen I didn't expect to happen. Why did this happen? And then figure out the solution to it and realize, okay, that makes perfect sense while we're doing this. So you start to kind of validate every step of like why things are done a certain way. And for me, that was really educational years ago, like 10 years ago when I watched it, even though I had barely been living in the US at the time, just because it was just seeing how certain ways countries have evolved and how certain things like immigration policies have been put in place for a very valid reason. So I recommend checking that out. I'll try and put a link in the show notes for that as well. And it's pretty quick, but I just thought it was just really, really fascinating. So I think it's best to have all that kind of stuff in place, because what's going to happen is they're going to go and speak to their lawyer or their firm or whatever, and they're the ones who are going to go and say, okay, we reviewed everyone, this person's work, and yes, this is a pretty valid case. And Amanda was saying that too, that they would look over the case and decide whether it's one that they want to take on, because if it's one that isn't valid, like if they don't think that they have enough evidence to actually make it happen, then that might be something they might say, now's not a good time, come back when this person's got more experience and more this, and this. Because again, like, you're not going to go through this massive 6-month process and spend the money to do it if you don't think there's a high success rate. So, if you're worried about that, it's better to try than not. And I think that's really important for everyone, just to kind of realize that it's better to try and do something. And, what's the worst that's going to happen is before anyone pulls the trigger and actually makes it an official process and makes it start happening, they're going to look it over and tell you whether or not you're good to go. And worst case, if you're not, then you can go back to the drawing board and work on it a bit more. But waiting, thinking like, okay, I got to get myself to this much experience and this much this, and this. And then one day, I'm going to look at trying to work in this other country when I've got everything together. It's better to go and look at it now and to see whether or not you qualify. And if you don't, then great. But if you do, you could be saving yourself a lot of time where you think that you're not ready, but you potentially could be. So why not give it a shot? Now, there are certain things you can do to, like now, before you're even ready, which will help you down the line. So I talked with Dan Rorty in episode 30, and again, I'll leave a link in the show notes, but we ended up talking a lot about visas, which I thought was really cool. And again, it's one of those episodes that sparked everyone like saying, holy crap, I want more information about this. And one thing that he's done a phenomenal job on was that he just put up like, if you go to danroarty.com, so DANROARTY.com, he basically put together a section on his website called Press. And, my feeling whenever I saw it, because I thought it was really brilliant, was that he's more doing that just as a way to kind of collect everything. So why not just put it in one place? So yeah, it does help. When people come across to your site, they see all the really great, fascinating stuff you've done and all the accomplishments, awards, whatever else. But in a way, you're forcing yourself to put together a big list of really great content that when the time comes, you present that to your visa lawyers. And it's just your way of like having a dedicated place to store and collect all your information about yourself. And essentially what you're doing is like all this kind of information being published in magazines and books, anything that's printed media, stuff like that, that is worth its weight in gold. Having an education, like a degree, is very important, but not a necessary thing. I don't have a degree, but if you have one of those, then that's definitely going to help a lot. And that's, I think, more just to do with how quickly the world changes, and policies aren't necessarily going to be able to keep up with that and say, okay, well, not everyone goes to university for this anymore. I think that if you're a doctor studying to be a brain surgeon, you shouldn't be on digital tutors, doing tutorials or whatever. It should be going and doing your proper process through university and collecting all the experience along the way. But there are other areas where they're not necessarily going to be able to keep up with how quickly the process changes. So design and visual effects and all that sort of thing is a good example where universities typically, it takes a lot to change a curriculum and to update it, whereas going online and seeing people who are like, hey, this morning I was on Star Wars and I figured out this really cool thing, I'm going to show you how to do it in this YouTube video. That sort of thing can be a lot more valuable because it's just the way that the world's structured, and in terms of like how quickly things are able to kind of come out and change and shift. So that sort of thing I think is just important to consider, is like, where you're getting your education from, whether it's self-taught or whether it's through more traditional means. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what's acknowledged as a way to measure how good you are is going to be able to keep up with that. So if you're trying to get a visa, a degree is still going to be something that is universally around the world recognized, and therefore having that formal education means a lot. Whereas in the industry, like if I were to go and flash my degree at Pixar or something and say hire me, it's probably not going to have as much clout as it would be saying this is how much skill I have. Pixar is actually a bad example because that can actually be really beneficial at Pixar, but in general, a paper education is not going to be as measurable as showing what your skill set is. So your portfolio of what you've done, in other words, actions speak louder than words, is a lot more valid. So depending on where you go, those sorts of things, like if you have it, great. And if you don't, then, it's not the end of the world, but like it definitely is one of those things that's a huge advantage. If you think of getting a visa like a point system, that would be something that's worth 50 points out of 100. Like it's a very big, vital part. Otherwise, work experience needs to compensate for that. And back in the day, it used to be 4 years for every year of your degree you don't have. So you would need to have 16 years of experience. That's not the case these days, but there was that point in time, which is why for me, I was like, man, this is going to take a lot longer than I expected. But just be aware of that you need to kind of build this stuff up. So any kind of press, any kind of print, anything you can do that you can showcase, it's better to start thinking about that stuff now. Even if you don't intend to work anywhere, you want to stay in your own country, having all that stuff for later on, like you never know when you might need it. Okay, so I really like Dan's approach of having like a page that he would store all of his press and PR stuff on, and it's more like a great thing he can put up there and people can see. But I knew from the very first time I saw it, like he's doing that as a way to put together a case very easily with all his stuff he's collecting when it comes to visas and green cards, that sort of thing. So that was like one of the first things I asked him when we kind of started talking about the subject in between drinks was, hey, was the reason for you building that page to do with just for your website, or was it specifically for visas? And he's like, yeah, exactly. It was for visas. So that way, when it came time for my green card or anything else, I could literally just collect like everything on that page and just send it out. And, that's my whole case in terms of all the media and everything. I didn't need to go fishing for it. So I thought that was really great. So that's something that I suggest all of you, everyone should do, is just have, like, you don't need to publish it online, but, why not? Why not showcase all this stuff that you've done if you want to? But either way, like, have a dedicated place, have a directory. Like, that's one thing I've always had, was just like a folder where whenever there's like a new magazine article, or if I wrote like a contribution for a book, anything like that, I would just quickly using, I think it's Evernote, but I think TechSmith has, like, I forgot the name of it. There's basically there's like a really cool screenshot tool, which is just invaluable, that you can use. But essentially, I just like draw a marquee over everything, hit a button, it'll save it as a file. And then I've got that saved, and it's just like, why not collect this stuff? And that way it's just going to be a lot more straightforward when you need to dig stuff up, rather than going through Google and fishing around trying to find stuff. But it's also good to be as proactive as you can with that. If 3D World Magazine or a lot of the other big ones ask you to do something, go and do it, because that small article you're writing, all those things add up, and it means that you can show, that you do all this stuff, that you're very proactive, and the fact that you're, again, like, this is how it's viewed and valued, that if you're writing for a magazine or a book, that means that you have something to say, and that means that you must be of a certain status. So I think it is really important, just wherever you can, take advantage of that stuff. Don't say no. One thing I want to talk about later on, probably in another episode, but is about kind of like working and sometimes working for free. This is like a gray subject that I actually want to touch base on a little bit. This episode was about like what happens if you don't get paid and how you should go about it. I'm going to leave that for another episode just because it's such a big one that I'm going to wait a little bit. But I like to think that when you are working on projects, sometimes the money aspect isn't the currency that you're going for. I like to look at everything pretty much from the perspective of, what do I want to get from this? And sometimes it's, I want to build a relationship with these people, or this is a chance for me to get experience in an area that I've never done before. I got a chance to direct a couple of commercials in New York a few years ago, and for me, that was worth the experience of doing it, even though, my goal wasn't to be a director or anything like that. It was so valuable to me for now and forever, just having that experience. And sometimes it's the publicity, getting to work on a Scorsese film or whatever it's going to be. These are all things that are really valuable, and you need to figure out what your currency is. It isn't always going to be money. Sometimes you're doing it for the money. Sometimes you're doing it for something else. So sometimes it can be really valuable to take on a job and like, maybe it's writing for a magazine or something like that, and it might only pay $200 for like a big article. So it's a bit of work, but that's, something you need for your visa or something else. So even though the money mightn't be necessarily good, you got to look at other ways that it can be really beneficial to you. So just think of those situations and how that's going to work for you in terms of the bigger plan. So because it's something you can't necessarily buy, So just figure out like, okay, if I'm doing something, maybe it's not going to pay well, but what are the other things that it can really help with? And sometimes that can even work into the negotiation. Like, okay, I'll do this and I'm only going to do it for this much money, but I'll only do it if I get to do some of the press, if I get to get interviewed for this later on, or whatever it's going to be, just think bigger when it comes to this stuff, and think about, my ultimate goal is I need to accumulate money and experience and this and this and this, but I also need to accumulate credentials. And so therefore this is one of those things that I need to look into doing and collecting this stuff now rather than doing it later on when you don't have enough time to kind of collect all of that. So just think about that stuff now. It's better to kind of work on it now, so that way if down the line you needed something, you can say, hey, I've got all this press material and I can throw this towards my case, and they can look at it like, okay, this is a no-brainer. We can get you in just because you've proven that you've accomplished so much. So yeah, really valuable, really important, and you never know when you could use that. Plus also, like, another episode I want to do on branding later on, but like, I think it is really key to talk about, thinking ahead and trying to build your name, trying to build the awareness around you and what you do. It's better if people have heard of you rather than not. Usually that's going to be a good thing, not always, but planning ahead and kind of like working on this stuff, it is part of your job. It isn't just about, I go and do my job and then I'll get work because I'm good. I've always said, like, you could be the best artist in the world, but if no one knows who you are, then how are you going to get work? And that applies here as well. So I think that it's always important to keep in mind, you are a business, and if you're not marketing and doing all that kind of stuff, then again, you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. You can always be humble with what you're doing. It doesn't need to be you going around like clapping some drums, telling everyone how great you are. It's more about strategically thinking about, hey, I'm doing this work and I want to get more work, so I need to get out there and maybe change the perspective on what people see me as well. So like, let's say you really enjoy doing title work, but most of the work you've done so far is more 3D renderings of architecture, stuff like that. This is a chance for you to start doing a few title pieces maybe in your spare time, but to really market yourself specifically as that, so that way people start to perceive you as a motion graphics title person or something. So again, all of this stuff, it's very important. It's important to think about all of this ahead of time. And another thing with visas is that whether or not you need to hire a firm to do it. The truth is you definitely can do it on your own. You don't need to go out and pay someone else to do it. You could go and do the whole thing by yourself. But the thing is that it is a big subject. It's just like anything else. If you were to say, okay, I'm a filmmaker and I need to go and get all the music composed, rather than hiring someone to do all the scoring like a composer, I'm just going to do it all myself. But the thing is that you're not an expert in music and you're doing this just because you want to save a penny or two. The things to keep in mind is the fact that maybe you're going to do a pretty bad job at it, and in the long run is basically going to cost you the movie. The movie's not going to look as good, or the project's not going to feel as good just because you did your own score to kind of save some cash. Maybe you do it because you enjoy it and you are good at it, and therefore it's not as big an issue. But for me, like, my whole perspective is that I mentioned like an analogy of doing taxes in episode 52 with Amanda, but I would look at like brain surgery. You could go and get the cheapest person to do it, or you could go pay more and that they're going to do the best job ever, and like, is it worth risking it? So doing a work visa, that is something that's going to probably take 6 months, maybe more. It's a big process. It does cost money. It's not like ridiculously expensive, but it does cost money. And why would you even think about pursuing it if you weren't going to try and maximize the success rate that you could have? So I think it's such a key thing to think about, is the fact that I would rather pay a little bit more money and know that I'm going to get it, rather than save a little bit of money and risk not getting it, and long term maybe making things more of a headache for myself. So usually it takes about 6 months. It costs, like in my experience, it seems to consistently cost about $6,000 when I hire a firm. And again, that price is going to change for different people and different situations. But again, these are just going through my experiences and friends of mine, their experiences as well. Usually it's cost about $6,000, takes about 6 months. But the thing is, hiring someone else to do it, they know everything. They know all the the best ways to approach something, so that way you're going to be showed in the best light, opposed to you just saying, okay, I'm a VFX artist and I'm just going to go and apply this way and this is what I'm going to do. They might know, like, you've got a lot of experience in this other area and this one is really held a lot higher than this, or whatever the situation might be. So again, just knowing someone who knows the process inside out and that's what they do for a living, that's always going to be a much better route, in my opinion. It's well worth paying the little bit of money. And it's not like they're making $6,000. Like, their fees are, I think, $3,500, something like that. And then, again, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the other part is just paying, the government and going through the whole process. And so I think that in the light of things, it's actually worth it. And again, usually if your employer is paying, going through it, they're the ones paying for it. It can differ depending on the situation, but usually they're the one who's going to pay the money, so you don't need to worry about that. Again, I'm just going to keep throwing things out rapid fire, but that also can be something that factors into your price, because initially it might look like they're paying for it, but technically they might deduct that out of your salary in terms of, let's say if you're working for a big company in LA, like Digital Domain, Rhythm Hughes, places like that. I have had friends of mine say like, man, I can't wait to get my green card, because then I'm going to be able to charge an extra $15 an hour when I'm working. And, so it's just one of those things that, they, just like anything, it is factored into your salary. So if they're paying for a visa, technically you're going to get paid a little less than you would, because they're sponsoring you and they're going through all this stuff. So, those sorts of things, it mightn't be really evident up front, but that's behind the scenes how everything gets budgeted. Same way that I've worked at places that they'll actually give you the option like, hey, we give you medical, dental for your family and all this other stuff. But if you already have all of that, it costs us about $15,000 a year to pay for all these additional things. You can have that money instead if you want to boycott that or bypass it. So some places are a bit more transparent about that. Other places, it's just, that's actually the hidden cost, is like whatever your salary is. If you said I want $70,000, technically you're getting $85,000, and going off on a tangent here, but same way that your vacation and everything else technically is like budgeted into your salary. So if you work somewhere and you don't use up all your holiday days, then you're essentially giving them a couple of $1,000s, each year, because that is money that they put aside for you. It all gets budgeted into your salary. So your salary might be, let's say, $70,000, but then there's all the medical, the dental, and everything else, plus vacation and sick days. All of that stuff accumulates up to maybe $20K or $25K, whatever. But whatever the price is going to be, those are things that technically are part of your salary. So your salary might be 70, it's really 95 or whatever it's going to be. And that's why, like, if you were to leave a company, it's better to use up all of your sick days and all your vacation days than not, because it's not like, oh, I'm getting some free days out of this. It's, you got paid for those technically. So if you're going to use them up, then great. And that's always been my motivation as a teenager when I was freelancing, was like, I'm paying for my days off. So, if I was sick, but like, just a little bit sick or hungover, and I'm like, I don't want to go to work, I'm like, I'm going to be missing out on this much money by staying at home. So screw that. I'm going to go to work unless I'm actually sick. I don't want to get everyone else sick. So keep that stuff in mind, that like, even though they might be paying for your visa, technically it's kind of coming out of your salary, and, those are just kind of more the behind the scenes things that do happen. But I do think that, it's night and day important that you hire someone who's a pro at doing visas and does that stuff for a living, because they're going to be able to take care of you, and they're going to, if something did happen, like if some problem does occur, then they're usually able to squash that right away, rather than it being like, oh crap, like I don't know what to do here, or you then go and make the problem even bigger by, saying or doing something that you just don't understand the process. So again, it's just better to hire people to kind of take care of something and let it go away. So it's kind of like my taxes. Like I see paying taxes like this. Okay, if I'm paying $50,000 or $100,000 or $10,000, whatever my taxes are going to be, my whole perspective and the way that I'm able to happily pay taxes, and I think maybe this should be everyone as well, because at the end of the year, if you're freelance, usually you've got to do your own taxes. It doesn't get deducted over time, so it might feel like a lot of money to suddenly give away to someone. But I just kind of see it like, okay, I'm paying $20,000 or $100,000, whatever it's going to be, to stay out of jail. Suddenly it's just like, oh, no problem. Like, I'm happy to give that money away. And that's essentially by looking at the perspective from a different angle, where instead of it's like I'm giving away $20,000 of my money, it's like, no, I'm basically paying $20,000 to stay out of jail. Suddenly I'm cool with this. And Wesley Snipes is a perfect example of someone who didn't pay the taxes and they had to find out the hard way. On a side note, for anyone who's having a beer with me at some point, just remind me to tell you the Wesley Snipes story. Now, again, just that's what I'm trying to hammer home here, is just, get someone else to take care of that. It's one thing less on your plate you don't have to worry about. And I think at the end of the day, that's just so much more crucial. You don't do your own dentistry. You don't do your own teeth. You go to a doctor, you go to a dentist, and let them take care of you. Get an expert to handle something. It's your life that you're going to be wasting time and money and opportunities on otherwise. Now, at the same time, like, the other benefit is that they might be able to give you a bit more insight. Like, I've got a friend of mine, he works at Allan in Singapore, and at the time, though, he was from New Zealand and wanted to go work in the US. And what actually happened was, this was, I guess, around like 2006, I think, when they created the E3 visa, which was like a new visa specifically for Australians. So I assume that it was the lawyers like suggested this, but basically it was very easy for him to become an Australian citizen because he'd lived over there. And Australia and New Zealand, as much as we love to pretend that there's animosity, like Canada, and the US, but Australia and New Zealand are pretty much the same country in a lot of ways. Some ways not. Some ways I like New Zealand more than Australia. But yeah, it was just one of those things where it was very easy for him to go from being a New Zealand citizen to acquiring an Australian citizenship to then be able to get an Australian visa to work in the US. So it might sound like a loophole, but it's just more, some countries are going to have a better or a more established relationship, and therefore, certain things are able to happen a lot quicker. So that was a situation or a really strategic move which worked out really well, because, him going from New Zealand to the US, it was a lot more work, a lot more waiting, a much bigger process, but he's able to say, okay, I'm going to get that thing, and that's going to get me in right away. And so that's a really cool kind of way to look at things. And so typically when I would go through the visa process, usually you find an employer, they would then go and say, okay, well, we'll go sponsor you. They speak to a law firm, like whoever handles their visas and everything, assuming they've done it before. And they decide, okay, yeah, this person is someone that we can make a case for. And then what will happen is they'll go through and start building a case. So they get all the credentials from you, everything that you've ever done, everything that they can use to essentially prove that you qualify to come to the States, and they can essentially fight for you to kind of make this happen. And that whole process takes a long time to put together the whole case, and has to go through all the legal terms and everything else again, which is why it's important, I think, to have a firm do it. And then they submit that to the USCIS. Hopefully I'm getting that right. Acronyms can sometimes, I can be a little dyslexic at times. And that's just a branch of the government that basically says approved or disapproved. And so what then happens is, like, once it gets submitted, it takes a bit of time. Usually then you get a letter saying you're approved, and then you need to take that letter to your consulate. So let's say you go to the US consulate in Sydney, Australia, or whatever you're going to be, wherever you are. Usually you have a consulate in a major city, so you fly in, go there, and it can be anyone really, but you would go in and you would present your case, and you would have an interview with them to basically go over whether or not you qualify. And so you bring in all your paperwork, you bring in the letter of approval, and they would then issue you your visa, and that would take a couple of days to do. And your passport will get mailed back with your visa stuff in there. And from there, you then are able to fly out to the States and go through immigration and everything. So just like you would any other time, and show all your paperwork to them. They let you in the country, and you get your I-94 stamp, which is basically just whenever you come into the country, you get issued how long you can stay there. And then you go about working. And, from there, there's a lot of steps. Like, I'd love to do an episode on what to do when you move to a new country, just because I've done it like maybe 10 times at this point. And, there's definitely things you can do to kind of help you make friends, help you get out and get to know people, or things you need to do when you first get set up. Because a lot of people, it's very intimidating when you first get in there. It's, what do you do then? And, so going to Social Security and getting your Social Security number, so therefore you could go to a bank and prove that you're a resident, so they can open a bank account for you. Some banks will do it without one, but usually that's the process, and all these other steps. But that, I just kind of wanted for me to do like this episode where it's a really kind of rough and raw look at like what you got to do. And so yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the steps to go and go from applying for a job and going in and getting the visa and doing all that stuff. Now, here's the big thing. And I talked about this a little bit in episode 52, but if you're applying for a job, and I call this the crazy first date or whatever, like if you go on your first date and you're instantly like, wow, like I I feel so attracted to you. I'm in love with you, and this is amazing. We should have kids and get settled down. And what is the first baby names we can think up of? Whatever it is, you're gonna freak someone out just like painting this picture and being so full on right away. And even if you are batshit crazy and that's what you do, you do it over time. You gradually ease into something. You don't just start throwing around these full-on committal situations and painting yourself to be a crazy, insane guy or girl, whatever. Basically you want this to be like a 1-2 punch. You want to initially build that relationship, and I've talked a lot about that, about initially approaching like a studio and saying like, hey, I'd really love to work for you, really big fan of your work, blah, 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 blah. Talk about that situation, and then once you've established that relationship, like the 1-2 punch, the second jab is the one that you start to lay on like, oh, by the way, here's the situation. Because you want them essentially to get the idea in their head that, yeah, I want to hire you, before you start to talk about the details. Because otherwise you can easily scare someone away with like baby names, by mentioning all these things up front and, essentially just making it like, wow, this is full on. If you were to email a studio and say, hi, I'm Allan, I've worked here, here, and here, I'd really love to work for your studio. Before we do that though, I need to go through a 6-month visa process, and you're going to need to spend like this much money, and I'm going to need you to hire a law firm and do all these other things. That's going to be like, whoa, okay, I'm just going to hire so-and-so down the street because it sounds way too complicated. And I think that's always a big issue. And like when I asked a lot of people on Facebook and Twitter, what are the questions you have? That was one that came up a lot, is like, what do you do in those situations? So one of the situations is, how do you get a company to sponsor you? Because usually it's going to turn them off doing this. And so again, I would email them and basically say like, hey, I'd really love to work for you, blah, blah, blah. And when they say, you know what, we looked over your work, we'd love for you to come work for us, then you can reply and say, awesome. Just to let you know, I currently reside in Australia. So there are a few things we need to do ahead of time, but I'd love to work for you guys, and I'd love to make this happen. So, what do we do to take the next step? And if you can actually walk them through the process, even though some places have experience with visas and they realize it's not actually that big a deal, there's just a waiting period, really. Other places mightn't know, and usually the less you know, the more scary things are going to sound. So I was helping one of my friends recently who was going through the visa process to work in the US, and she was coming into architecture. And, what we talked about it a lot, and just kind of like how to approach it in a way that she's going to get the highest success rate out of this. And what we decided was this, that she would initially contact them, and then when they came back, because she was happy to pay for the visa and all that stuff rather than it being on them. And I think that was like a really big step to, it might cost you that, but remember what I said before about your salary. Like technically, whatever you're asking for, they're probably going to include the visa cost and everything in that if they're smart. So her paying for it is really just her paying for it up front and asking for a little less than she would. And so she would initially apply for the position and get them interested. They would look at her credentials, and then she'd say, by the way, and for me, this was an important thing I said to her, was to really educate them on the process, but also in a way where you're basically acting like it's no big deal. Okay. Because if you were able to say like, oh yeah, like, by the way, I need a visa, but it's pretty straightforward. We just need to do this, this, and this. I'll cover the costs. Literally, all you need to do is to sign a letter or two, and I'll take care of everything else. Then for them, that's going to be like, oh, is that all? Okay, well, yeah, no problem. Like, how long is this going to take? And that's exactly what happened. She basically lined up a couple of places that were interested, and then she would just say, by the way, I need to get a visa, but this is really straightforward. I've already looked into it all, and I can get the E3 visa, so that way it's going to cost like this much money. I'm going to cover the costs and everything else. You literally just need to sign, as I mentioned, like this bit of paper, and it's going to take about this long. And suddenly, like, you've done all the thinking, you're taking care of it all. For them, it's not a scary thing. It's going to be like, oh, okay, that sounds scary for a moment, but if it's just that, then yeah, okay, that sounds cool. So what do we do next? And that's it. So for her, she actually went to Amanda's company and basically spoke to them and said like, I want a visa. They got in contact with the employer, and they worked it all out, and it was a really straightforward process. And she got the job and moved over here. She had to go back to Australia just for a visa interview, that sort of thing. So that's the sort of thing where rather than trying to throw it all out there in your initial letter, just freak the hell out of someone, you do it in a few steps and you do it gradually. So baby names on the third date, okay? Hopefully I'm not offending anyone by saying that. I can't imagine how I would be, but you never know. So, but that's just it. You don't want to freak people out just by painting this big committal picture. You want it to be in a gradual process where as long as you know what's going on and you can guide them through it, then to them it's like, okay, I don't need to research this. It isn't as scary as it sounds, that whole thing. So usually that's how I'd approach it. And I think that that's also important for you so that way you know what to do. And another thing that I know came up as one of the questions was, what happens if on the job page they say you must have a current active US visa to work for our company, okay? Or whatever it's going to be, working visa, wherever country you're in. And that's another thing to keep in mind, that even though they might say that, that doesn't necessarily always mean the case. Like, I'll give a quick analogy of this, and this was a really good friend of mine at Weta. He's one of the guys running Weta at this point. He initially wanted to apply there as an animator years and years and years ago, and he didn't think that he could because on Weta's page it said you must have, for Lord of the Rings, you have to have 4 years of feature film experience to work here, minimum. So that meant that he needed to be working in movies for at least 4 years. And so he didn't want to do it. And that was one of those situations, again, where I was like, dude, that doesn't matter, apply, because you're better than freaking everyone, you're amazing. And he ended up applying and getting the job right away. But my understanding of that was that when they put out something like you got to have this much experience, it's to filter out the 99% of people who want to apply. Because like if you're in commercials and let's just say that you're not good, okay, you're really hungry, you're really excited, you want to go work for the biggest studios, maybe you're a little naive and you're like, I've been doing logos for a while, and again, not to offend anyone, let's say I've been doing terrible logos. I'm just trying to paint the picture here, okay, that this person has not got the experience to go walk into a feature film studio, do Lord of the Rings back in 2002 or 2001, and, rock the shit out of everything. So in that situation, having that little deterrent by saying you've got to be this good, that's going to make everyone be like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe it's not I'm not good enough. Maybe I need more experience to get in here. So I'll wait a couple of years until I get that feature film experience. So a lot of people who would be applying would maybe then be a bit more hesitant. But the ones who are really good, maybe you don't fit quite that criteria, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be like, okay, well, I better not apply now because I don't have that, one thing on the resume, even though I know I'm very capable of doing the work. Like with my friend Dave, he had 1 year of feature film experience, I believe. But that 1 year, he'd been animating forever and he's freaking amazing. So it was just a given that if he went in there, he could rock it, and he did. So just keep that in mind, that like, even though there might be these deterrents, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get the job. If you're good, they'll fight for you. But it means that, if they have a lot of people saying, hey, I want to come work for your company, I need a visa, then, a lot of times it's going to be like, okay, well, this is going to be a lot more work and we're not really prepared for it. So it's just easier to kind of put that as a prerequisite. You must be legal to work here. But if you come along and you're freaking amazing and you don't have a current visa for that country and they're like, wow, we really want to get this person in, then that's fine. Like they will do that. Okay. So why rob yourself of an opportunity just because it says on that thing that you may need this thing? I've gone for jobs where it's like you must have a degree or a bachelor in science and you need to code in Python and C++, and I can code, but I don't consider myself a programmer. I'm not like, I can get by, okay? So for me, like, I don't have a bachelor in science. I don't have like all these other credentials, but if I feel like that is a position that might be, something I can do, I'm still going to apply, and like, I'll let them be the judge. Like if they want to say, no, you got to have this piece of paper, fine, okay? But I'm not going to say, well, I fit the criteria of everything they want, but I don't have that piece of paper, or, that area I'm not as good in. I fall short in programming, but the on-set experience and the managing teams and everything else I can really do. I'm going to look at that as something that I should address with them and say, hey, just FYI, like I'm interested in working for you guys. However, I don't have the experience in that one area. If it is a huge necessity, then, I'm definitely hungry, willing to learn. I'll do what I can, but, I'm not that guy or I'm not that girl. But these are the credentials that I'm really solid in. I'm really confident about. I can do it. And I'll let them be the judge. Okay, same way. Hey, I want to come work for you. All this stuff. Later on, bringing up the visa in the second email or whatever. That's when I would say, by the way, don't have a work permit right now, so that's one thing I need. But again, I'm happy to kind of look into that and work with you guys on it. Hopefully we can get turned around right away. Whatever it's going to be to paint the picture is not a big deal, okay? But then they can come back and say, no, we definitely need someone who's got a visa, or okay, well, we'll make the exception, okay? So I just want to put that out there because I know a lot of people are going to be like, oh, I really wanted to work at this place, but unfortunately I don't have a visa. The thing is that, especially as I've been talking about in the US, usually you're not going to have one. They're going to be the one who's going to need to do that for you. So you're not going to be sitting there twiddling your thumbs with a valid visa necessarily, in the US, let's say. Like, you pretty much need to be employed at all times. One other thing I'll mention, and Amanda talked about this, was about O1 visas, which is essentially the extraordinary visa, or as I was referring to it, the Kanye West visa. But, that's one of those things that, if you have one of those, I know she was saying you're more lenient with who your sponsor is. And that is that it doesn't necessarily need to be your employer that's sponsoring you. It can be other things. And this can apply in other areas too. Like if you want to come over for like a J1 visa, which is more like an apprentice visa, or I think there's like a L1. I met someone at brunch the other day who had an L1 visa, which is basically a visa that you come from another company. If I understand this correctly, let's say they have a company in Australia, but they have a US branch. You could come and work over here under that branch. So a J1 is like an educational visa. And I know in those situations, maybe the company doesn't sponsor you. It's actually a different company altogether that might sponsor you to come over here. And then, essentially you'll work for them, but you're sponsored by someone else. And the same thing with the O1, like you can be sponsored by, one company, but you work like freelance elsewhere as like a sole proprietor of that. So let's say like DAA, like Digital Artist Agency, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. They're a place in the US. It's an agency, so they hire all this talent and they'll essentially manage you. So, like I know Zsolt Poxos, I had on the podcast a while back. He's someone who's sponsored through DAA. And what they would do is they would essentially sponsor you, so that way your visa's with them. But you would essentially then get sent out to do different jobs at different companies, and they take a small percentage of your fee, but they would find the work, they would line it all up, negotiate your money. You would just need to show up and do the work. And I actually want to get Bob Coleman from DA on here at some point, just because I do like the idea. I don't think it's ideal for everyone, but for me, I thought about it for a minute just because I thought it'd be great to essentially have someone else doing the hard negotiation rather than, me having to worry about like, negotiating money and being really kind of stiff about it all. I can let someone else do all of that, and I can pick and choose the jobs that I wanted. And I liked that idea. However, just for me, especially right now, it's just, I'm not looking to do like heavy amounts of freelance work, whereas I would in the past. So those kind of companies though, like that could be a really great thing where you get someone to sponsor you who doesn't necessarily need to be your employer. Okay. Again, that sort of relationship's one that you build up over time. I don't think you could just email them, say, hey, I'm living, wherever, I'm in Singapore or I'm in Berlin and I want to come to the US, sponsor me and bring me over. I don't think it's going to really work that way. It's going to be more like a relationship that you build up over time. And, eventually if like you needed that to stick around, then that's an option you could have. But, that all being said, I just want to kind of mention that to say that it isn't always necessarily going to be your employers. You can think outside the box a little bit and make other opportunities happen. I'm getting so tongue-tied right now, so I'll start wrapping things up. The final few things I wanted to mention was if, let's say like, and again, I might get this completely wrong, but let's say you're from India or other countries, like I got a few people asking me about whether there's any prejudice to certain countries over others. And I even had one person saying, like if you're white, will you get more chances for a visa than if you're, not white, basically. And, I think that those questions are kind of BS. In general, no, like the skin color is never going to play a role. Whereas again, certain countries are going to be have a better relationship with certain other countries, and certain other ones mightn't. They might have history. Let's say you're from Cuba or somewhere. You probably aren't going to be able to get a work visa very easily. Those, at least in the past, things are actually changing a bit now. But those sorts of things you do need to kind of consider. it's never a race thing, but it will sometimes be, from my understanding, that certain countries are going to have certain relationships. So Australia might have a really strong relationship with the US, whereas like other countries mightn't have as well as established one. And I do know that certain other countries, like, that every country will have like a set amount of people they can let in every year. So let's say you are from India, obviously a really big population, and there's obviously a lot of tech jobs, but there's a cap of how many people for every visa for every country that can come in. So that country might hit that cap very quickly. Like you look at Australia, our industry is tiny, so it's going to be a little bit easier. Whereas like other countries, you have a mass population and a mass industry, then it's going to be a lot quicker to kind of hit that cap. So usually what ends up happening is like when you're working with certain firms, you might get signed up for their immigration list. And so what happens is you get newsletter updates about, whenever that cap gets reset and how many positions there are. And it's kind of like the stock exchange or something. You can kind of see like when's a good time to go through the process and everything else. So those are all things to keep in mind. Like sometimes you might want to apply, but basically you'll get the visa, but you're going to have to wait a certain amount of time before that cap gets reset so you can come back in, okay? But just in general, I figure it's well worthwhile mentioning this just because that does play like a bit of a big role at times depending on where you're applying and everything else. But just keep that in mind. Same thing with age. I know a director buddy of mine back in Australia was asking about age, and a few people will mention that as well. I know with like I mentioned earlier about the holiday visas and stuff like that, like if you're part of the Commonwealth, which is like all the countries kind of owned or established by the Queen, so London, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, like a lot of other, where else? Anyway, like Ireland, whatever. All those countries are going to have a solid relationship with each other, same way Canada and the US does. So because of that, it can be easier to acquire things and go through that process. Again, a good reason why New Zealand to Australia to the US, that kind of loophole can work really well. So in those situations, like getting a working visa for London, I know if you're under 33, I think, something like that, you can do it. And I think that would be more the fact that like you're acquiring these life experiences, you're doing it when you're young, and that's kind of like why they're set up. So you can travel around and have like a cheap job, like working at a Whistler in Canada, which a lot of Aussies do in Vancouver, and where you might be making minimum wage, but you're living and getting to travel and have that experience. So I think age comes in there for certain visas, but in general, I don't think it's really going to matter too much like how old you are if you're applying for a regular visa. So I might leave that there. This is just a lot of stuff that I kind of wanted to rattle on about. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert. I have had many different visas at this point, and it's just more over time something that I've like acquired a lot of knowledge about, and just having worked with so many other people who've gone through that as well. But at the end of the day, I'm not an expert, and whatever I'm saying is more just my views or my experience with this whole subject. So again, like I'm hoping this maybe shed some light and maybe kind of gives you some insight into everything. But at the same time, I would suggest at some point talk to an expert who knows their stuff and can kind of confirm or deny whether Allan's full of shit, basically. So if you have questions, whatever, feel free to follow up. Amanda Gillespie is definitely someone I consider to be the expert on the stuff. So if you go to episode 52, I'll list it in the show notes. She's got all her contact information if you want to reach out to her and her firm. But definitely talk to an expert. But I do hope this kind of sheds some light. And I kind of wanted to do this, as I mentioned, as my own kind of non-official episode, just because there's definitely a lot of stuff I kind of wanted to talk about. And I just kind of feel like I'd rather do the rough and rugged approach in addition to what we covered, because I felt like there's more of a consistent theme with episode 52, whereas this is more kind of just like the random stuff that I wanted to just kind of throw in there as well. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Happy holidays for everyone. Hit the ground running in 2016. This is going to be awesome, and I can't wait to get even more email about like everyone's goals. It's been really great to kind of like hear everyone's all psyched and like really got big plans and want to really achieve a lot next year. I think it's so freaking awesome. So do it. Get off your butt and go do it. I'm going to be back next year being next Monday, and hopefully not a massive hangover to go with it. Anyway, Happy New Year, and I'll see you next year.